There she is. All right. Introducing our next speaker is Lori Talcott.
Hi, hello. Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for being here. Only this incredible lineup of speakers could keep us inside on such a beautiful day in Seattle. My name is Lori Talcott, and on behalf of the Seattle Metals Guild, it is my great pleasure to welcome and introduce Beatriz Cortez. I first encountered Beatriz's work as a result of my computer spying on me, the algorithm bringing up one of her lectures on YouTube. I was immediately drawn in by her warmth, her beautiful ideas, and the material power of her work. Beatriz's work is speculative. It resides in the realm of the subjunctive, where all things become possibilities. It asks us to make community and seek wisdom from ancestors other than humans and the land itself. Beatriz Cortez is a multidisciplinary artist, scholar, and cultural and literary critic. She holds a PhD in literature and cultural studies from Arizona State University and an MFA from California College of the Arts. She is currently an associate professor of art at UC Davis. Beatriz has received numerous fellowships and residencies, including the Atelier Calder residence in France, the Borderlands Fellowship, and most recently, she was named Latinx Artist Fellow from the US Latinx Art Forum. Currently, Beatriz has a solo exhibition at Williams College of Art, and 3 of her sculptures are on exhibit at Storm King Art Center in New York. This past summer, as part of the Arctic Circle Expedition Program, Beatriz joined 12 other artists, researchers, and scientists on a trip to the Arctic Circle in search of particles of Earth from the underworld. I hope she'll speak more about that today. Beatriz has been described as a groundbreaking and visionary artist. Her work comprises simultaneous and converging temporalities, from geologic time to speculative imaginaries of the future. Her work draws from her own experience of migration and an expansive philosophical framework. Her projects disrupt anthropocentric perspectives and look to ancient, futuristic, and object-centered models to address the pressing concerns of the moment. Please join me in welcoming Beatriz Cortez.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. Over here I have an image of the first work I ever made in steel. One that I made before I learned how to weld. And one that I made before learning really how to work with metal. Armor for Rufina Maya was made in 2015. And I would like to begin by thanking Lori for the amazing hospitality, for the beautiful introduction. I'm really enjoying exploring her studio, which is filled with amazing tools. Lynn for all the work with logistics, and all the work that connected me to the rest of the committee. Thank you for the invitation that allowed me to be here today. Andy, thank you for all the work with the technology. Andy for the leadership also, and the entire organizing committee for inviting me and taking care of every detail of my visit. I'm honored to be here among you. It feels like being invited to enter a clubhouse. I never thought I would have the right to enter the home of the metal workers, the ones who know metal by trade, by experience, by years of labor, by the creation of their art. And I come here with joy and with humility to tell you about my process, which is in many ways one that has been and continues to be self-taught. It often emerges from an effort to follow a conceptual idea, to turn it into an object with multiple temporalities, to build a time machine. Slowly I realized that the act itself of working with metal carries conceptual meaning, and I have been open to learn from it as one of my greatest teachers. The second sculpture I built with steel was this one, Black Mirror. It was the result of a residency in the auto body shop at Cerritos College where I really learned. That was my first residency after I finished my MFA at CalArts. And I went there without knowing much what I was going to do there, and also was the first time that the auto body shop was having an artist there, so they also didn't know what I was doing there. And that's really where I learned how to weld. And ironically, Black Mirror was made without welding. It required the use of a hole puncher, a shrinker, and a stretcher. And I realized then how much I love different types of technologies, older tools, and tools that were accessible to people who didn't have a lot of time in a studio with, I don't know, an air compressor, or time in a studio with power tools, etc. I was really fascinated by the way those, the technology can allow you to time travel as well. And it was made in the manner of making custom car parts, but it was tied with zip ties. And by doing that, it was like tying a corset made of knives with a delicate thread made of plastic. And I learned a lot about that process. I learned especially about how people in general imagine steel as permanent, solid, unmovable. They talked about steel buildings as buildings that don't fall, and how I work with the material needed, in order for me to work with the material, I needed to imagine it soft, malleable, giving, and forgiving. And so it was especially difficult to convince people that this work could be installed in the space using zip ties. In fact, I had to bring an engineer who worked at SpaceX to speak about how space capsules are sent and come back with, from space, tied with zip ties, in order to get approval for this installation. However, this became important, and I did use zip ties with other pieces that I built after this time. For years, it was because I wanted to make visible the precarious nature of shelter, but also of steel as a material itself. And here I'm showing you a work that I built much later with welded frames and car hood sections. It's called 108 car hood shield. My next work was my way of being present in Los Angeles at the turn of the 20th century. The construction of craftsman homes incorporated an indigenous way of building with river rocks in what came to be known as a vernacular style of architecture. It was an ancient form of construction applied to a modern architectural style. It was a syncretic way of building within and outside of modernity in a simultaneous way, and I love that. The first thing I built was a fireplace. In my effort to honor this form of construction, I had to learn how to make rocks. I remember very clearly, I went to the community welding shop and I said, I want to make rocks, and they said, you can't make rocks. And it took me a long time to figure out how to make them and how to pile them. I read all the archives where this man by the name of Dan Montelongo, who was an Apache Mescalero, built there 100 years before I lived in San Fernando, had built all these porches and the pillars in the porches of the craftsman style homes that are all over that place. And in the Stonehurst district in Los Angeles, if you ever go to Los Angeles, there's 92 of his homes preserved there. And so I had read about how he piled them and how to build a fireplace, and so I decided, well, I'm going to build a fireplace to look like that, but I'm going to build a frame that looks like a table, and then I'm going to cover it with sheet metal, and then I'm going to, it's going to be flat, and I'm going to make the crown molding, and then I'm going to put the rocks on top, and I welded the river rocks that I made. And while I shaped each of these river rocks, I imagined myself as a river, and I thought of the long lives of rocks, about how they form, about how they travel dragged by water as they are being polished by the rivers. And by then I was already thinking about space capsules, because building Black Mirror put noise into my head, made me think, among other things, that one can build with segments and with sections that I could carry, that could fit in my car, that I could make all the different pieces and assemble them together. And I was obsessed with the idea of building a spaceship that could carry my own life, that next time that I migrated, I was going to take everything and I was going to make a space capsule that had a fireplace and my favorite chair and a desk and a bookshelf. But also that could carry my culture, the culture of my community, into the future, if not into the cosmos. And this is when I built LA Vernacular Space Capsule Interior, which is what you're seeing here. And I began building other constructions. For example, I began making the porch of my next door neighbor's home, which was built by Dan Montelongo, in my opinion. I began walking around the neighborhoods where Dan Montelongo built and trying to tell apart the different constructions and to honor somebody who was so invisible and so amazing in my eyes. And so I continue to explore this placement of the river rocks as a form of construction that was nomadic, and that the idea of a steel structure as a time machine was potentially also nomadic. And I decided to build the porch of my next door neighbors. And located inside and outside a home, the porch was an interesting symbol for me, because it was both public and private. It was a space that was inviting, and at the same time it's a space that is that seals the home from unwanted presence, and that makes the home uninviting at the same time. The porch exists both inside and outside modernity. It was built in a way to resist industrialization, especially these craftsman porches. But in an effort to bring beauty to daily life, all this craftsmanship of the porch then ended up becoming a symbol of privilege. And it was linked to the back to the land philosophy that encouraged the construction of things with local materials. In this case, in Los Angeles, all these porches are built with rocks from Tohonga Wash. And so it exhibited an ancient indigenous way of construction with rocks, but evoked all these structures like the Templo Mayor built by the Aztecs, the pyramids built by the Maya, the way that the Inca people built the aqueducts with river rock, etc. And so while porches are often represented as part of a homogeneous American tradition, they have these legacies that are multicultural, that relate both to the history of slavery, of slave labor, the construction of emerging towns and urban spaces, the history of colonization in the United States and in the Americas. And it's a very complex symbol, and it can at once represent a space of cultural coexistence and a colonial legacy. And as part of a craftsman home, it also represents a history of resistance to industrialization. A porch opens up a space of community interaction, while at the same time isolates the home. And so the Lakota porch became at once a sculpture about time warps and about gentrification, and a time traveler. And I was super interested in how this sculpture that evoked my next door neighbor's home had been brought into light the fact that that home had been built by an Apache Mescalero builder, and that it was made in the main drag of San Fernando, which became a space of privilege. And through a process that's the opposite of gentrification, went back to the hands of an indigenous woman and became the Lakota porch. And so my next door neighbor, a Lakota woman, lives there and occupies that space of beauty. And in that process, to me, this porch became a time traveler that also spoke of the potential that a building has of going back to the hands that built it in a period of 100 years. From there, I moved to the cosmos and I built a space capsule that invited viewers to imagine indigenous aesthetics in our future. It has river rock fireplace in its interior as well as rocks in its exterior. However, these are stones from another place and time, formed by sheet metal extracted from the earth and produced for industrial purposes and brought back to the earth to exist as stones, but also in my mind they were rocks from elsewhere that imagined a moment in the future when we will have used all the resources available and there will be no more rocks except the ones that we make with industrial materials. And so these are rocks that could very well be the remnants of industrialization of the human era or the Anthropocene, rocks from the future. And I was making all these while at the same time I had a life as a scholar and a literature professor, a professor of Central American literature and cultural studies. I was part of a team of scholars who built the first department of Central American and transborder studies in the nation that continues to be the only one of its kind. And it is a space that was built not thinking of identities or nationalism. Anyway, Central America includes 7 different nations, but instead it's a program that is about simultaneity, it's about lives shared across borders and about multiple ways of becoming. And so one day while working in my studio, I realized that there was a contradiction between the work that I was making as someone who was making art about the experience of war and the experience of migration, and someone who was a scholar of nomadism, of becoming, whoa, I don't know what happened, but hold on. Maybe this is gonna play by itself. But a scholar of nomadism and of the future, and so I thought, well, there's a contradiction, and working in my studio, I was trying to think through that and pretty much became a crisis. I couldn't really sort it out. Is there a way to turn off the autoplay, Andy?
Yeah,
I'm so sorry.
there should be.
But I don't know how to do it. So anyway, I thought, wow, I don't know how to solve this problem. But I was thinking a lot about it, and at the time when I was thinking of philosophy, I wasn't thinking of philosophers. Thank you so much. I wasn't thinking of philosophers as something academic or something that you find in books, but I was more thinking of philosophers, especially my favorite ones, thank you so much, as ones that exist in as imaginary friends in my pocket. I could carry them with me and talk to them all the time, and I love that idea that, you know, these philosophers were around and I could have a fight with Spinoza because how can, sorry. Maybe I should get my computer because my computer won't do that.
I think if we, which one did we start on, 16?
I'm here.
Yeah, no. I think we just advance with that button instead, it might not do it.
It's,
Yeah.
moving on its own. Maybe that.
Yeah.
Yes, maybe. Let's see what happens, but if not, I'll just keep going back. Hopefully I won't lose my thread, but in any case, so I was thinking of these philosophers and I was thinking that they're able to have conversations with me, and I was having a fight with Spinoza because how could my favorite philosopher, the last paragraph that he wrote on this earth was that women are unequal to men, and that maybe women by natural right is demonstrated that they just cannot they cannot be equal, and then he died, and I was like, maybe he could have died one paragraph earlier or one paragraph later, but not then, and I can't go back to the 17th century to have a fight with Spinoza, but those were the conversations that I was having with him and with other philosophers, and I imagined that the laws, because I'm a Deleuzian scholar, would come to my studio and visit. And at the time I was reading The Posthuman by Rossi Braidotti, and Rossi Braidotti writes about untimely conversations and the untimely, and so I was imagining that we're having this untimely conversation. And I was fascinated by the possibility of having these untimely conversations with different people that were not there, and as a way also to deal with death and becoming. And so I imagined an untimely conversation with Deleuze. And I imagined that he visited my studio at CalArts and that he saw my work, but that he complained, that he said, I decided to make a moment in the past, the war, the central element of my work. The most important moment in your life already happened. I imagined that he said, and that he slammed the door, and I said, hold on. I didn't even get to answer, but he was gone. And that really became a crisis for me, and I began to think a lot about how to solve that, because this theoretical framework is so important to me. It's really, in many ways, the center of everything I see in the world, and the spirituality in my life, and the way I decide everything, and the way I face things. If I am heartbroken because something happened, because something didn't go well, because I didn't get recognition that I deserve, because somebody didn't love me, because something happened, Spinoza would say, recognition is not important. You don't want recognition. That's a sad passion. What you want is something else that empowers you to create, not recognition. You don't want that. That's paralyzing. So I was always so close to this theory that I couldn't really let go of it, and I needed to find a way to let go of the way I was dealing with the past, but I couldn't let go of the war because there's dead people in the war that I loved and that are not alive and that cannot speak on their own. And how can you say, I'm just not going to talk about that anymore? It's not something you can do, especially when there's no justice, especially when there's disappeared and you have to keep looking for them. It's not possible. And so it was kind of like at this very moment when I didn't know what to do. And so as a result, the concept of time and the ability to intervene in the chronological order of time became important for me and for my work. And one of the philosophers that impacted my understanding of time was Peter Osborne, because he questions the imposition of modernity as a way to establish a chronology and also a universal narrative of time. He argues that the effort to establish a narrative about modernity towards progress, towards development, is also a colonial and homogenizing effort to erase diversity. So rather than a chronology, Osborne is interested in the exploration of different modernities coexisting simultaneously. Ideas about speculative realism, the posthuman, philosophies of extinction invited me to consider the imposition of seeing humanism, liberalism, the Enlightenment as the only way, a colonial way to understand reason, and with it to understand time. So instead I began looking at earlier versions, earlier ways of understanding time, and that allowed me to go back to that moment when Spinoza was writing in the 17th century, which is at the brink of modernity, but also to indigenous peoples whose ideas and philosophies are very similar to the speculative, nomadic philosophies that I was reading with Deleuze, Guattari, Braidotti, and others. And so I became interested in these other ways of understanding time, circular conceptual constructions of time, multiplicity, simultaneity. This work is called Chultuna El Semillero, and it's installed in this photo at the Smithsonian Arts and Industries. It's a space capsule for seeds, and it carries the instructions for the distribution of seeds. It was made during the pandemic, so it also carries the instructions for the distribution of the vaccine, of course. So, in any case, let's see, where was I? And I began making works thinking of the future, although in hindsight, they were simultaneously evoking the past. For instance, this piece, Chultuna El Semillero, or this one, Generosity One, which are both space capsules for ancient seeds, and this one has ancient seeds in these little pods. I didn't make it thinking of COVID. I made it before COVID, but it actually looks exactly like COVID, which was kind of interesting to me. However, the future is also a metaphor for chronologies, a symbol of a timeline. So I worked with the future for a lot of years, and eventually I hit another crisis, which was, are you sure that when you're talking about the future, you're not going back to chronologies? And I couldn't be sure of that. I think the future carries a timeline. It's a symbol of a timeline. And so these days I have been thinking that I would like to renounce to the future and not think of the future as a horizon, or at least to read my works from the present, but from a present that is filled with multiplicity and simultaneity, the present as a metaphor for the multiverse, but also as a metaphor for different temporalities that include the future, but include the past at the same time. This is a building that I made in steel, thinking of El Caracol, which is the observatory at Chichen Itza, around a circular building that was carved in stone by the ancient Maya. And I would like to mention here a quote from a lecture that Delos gave to his students on March 25th, 1980, and I really want to dedicate this quote to all those of you who are working with metal. He was talking about space and about how there are 3 types of space that he could see. He said, a diagram, and by the way, these lectures are awesome. They're like the lectures that inform 1,000 Plateaus, which is the most important book that people read by Delos and Guattari, but these are the lectures that Delos gave, and they have never been published in English or in French, but without permits in a publishing house in Argentina called Cactus, they published all his lectures from the recordings made by his students. And so I read them all immediately because that was so much fun to like attending a lecture. And this happened when I was 9 years old. So he was talking about space and about these 3 types of space. He said there's a diagram space, which he calls striated, but it's a space that is rigid, that forces us to move in certain ways and certain direction. And then there's the smooth space, or the nomadic space, which is when you have deterritorialized the diagrams and then you have a smooth space, and once again it's reterritorialized and you deterritorialize it. But there's moments when you're able to move like a nomad through space, and then modernity comes in again and you have to fight it again. But he said there's a third space that he called metallurgic. And of course this caught my attention immediately, and I had a blast reading what he thought was working with metal, because his description of working with metal has nothing to do with what I do, and I bet you has nothing to do with what you do. It has everything to do with what I do as an artist, the creation of time warps and spaces of simultaneity, but how he described it is that the space filled with holes is something that the metal workers create, and they dig on the ground, they dig holes. And I was thinking, I wonder if Delos thinks that metal workers go to the ground, dig holes, bring out the metal, and then use it. I don't know what he was thinking, but the space filled with holes that metal workers live in the world is something quite curious, he said, and I believe that the space filled with holes is one of the most fundamental points, one of the most important points in the history of humanity, he said. And so then imagining the world of people who inhabit metallurgical space. The Los and Guattari wrote later in A Thousand Plateaus that these are people who transpierce mountains instead of scaling them, excavate the land instead of striating it, bore holes in space instead of keeping it smooth, turn the earth into Swiss cheese. So that you know now what metal workers do. And I really like this quote because it speaks about metal workers as creators of portals. And maybe he was right, and the makers of space filled with holes. Metal workers, for these philosophers, are not nomadic and they're not sedentary. We inhabit a third space. This is the roots of a ceiba tree, one of our most recent works. That's a collaboration with two other artists, Philip Byrne, who made these polyps that are coming out of it, and Tatiana Guerrero, who made these parasites that are on it. So going back in time to that moment in March 1980, while teaching class, in his metaphor, Deleuze speaks of a space filled with holes as a space that does not meet emptiness. And this is what's really important. He says a hole never leads to emptiness. He says a hole is like a portal from which other worlds pour out. And therefore, this third space is a space that is not linked to the surface of the earth, like nomadic space, and it's not linked to the soil, like diagrammed or sedentary space, but it is a space that is linked to the subsoil, or what, thanks to the ideas of ancient indigenous cultures from Mesoamerica, I like to call the underworld or el bajo mundo. These holes, these portals, are entrances to the underworld and are also ways for matter that is part of the underworld to pour out of those holes into our world. Because I come from Mesoamerica, volcanoes, and particularly their craters, are the most visible holes on the landscape, and pouring particles and gases from the underworld into the atmosphere is what they do. So this leads me to Ilopango, the volcano that has occupied my attention for over a year, and this is an image of Ilopango, the volcano that left, installed at Storm King Art Center in New York, where it is right now. The Ilopango volcano continues to exist in what is now El Salvador as an active volcano under the water in what is now Lake Ilopango, a place where I used to swim when I was little, but I didn't know there was a volcano under the water there because people don't talk about that volcano really in El Salvador that much. It once was a massive stratospheric volcano that disappeared from the landscape on a day that is estimated as the year 536 of this era. And if you look up that year, there's lots of publications about how that was the worst year to be alive in the history of humanity. Although there are no records of its shape, no drawings or stone carvings to imagine its looks, so I had to speculate on the way that it would look. It had an estimated 6,000 meters in height, based on its eruption, and at the site of the eruption, the mass of the volcano collapsed and the caldera that was formed filled with water, creating this beautiful lake that continues to be there today. The particles of the volcanic eruption disseminated across the atmosphere, blocking the sun for several months and eventually falling on different landscapes around the planet. Some of these particles have been found in large urban centers such as Mexico City. In other cases, they were preserved under a layer of glacial ice in the Arctic Circle and in Antarctica and have been found in some of the samples that exist in labs around the world, including the United States, of iceologists who have ice core samples in their labs. Ilopango is installed with two other works in this show, Cosmic Mirror, which are these rocks that you see here, and a stela that I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. This summer, as Lori was saying, I went to the Arctic Circle in a speculative search for these particles, and while traveling with my artist companions on the Antigua, I imagined that the sun also darkened for 18 months in the Arctic, that these landscapes were also showered with the particles of this volcano. During my time in Spitsbergen, we found icebergs filled with air bubbles and examined chunks of ice under the microscope until I was able to locate a particle in one of them. Are these particles potentially from Ilopango? Maybe. What I found in the Arctic is the movement of matter across other types of matter, dragged by the ocean currents, by melting ice, released into the atmosphere. There is so much there that I will have to leave these ideas for another time, but in any case, the consequences of that eruption were severe. The devastation that it produced stopped the Arctic production of the classical period in the region for several years. The survivors had to migrate in massive numbers out of the impacted area for several decades. In what is now central Mexico, the great urban center of Teotihuacan was abandoned a few years after this eruption. In other parts of the world, one second, hold on. In other parts of the world, that year had a never-ending winter. Crops were lost and temperatures dropped, as was documented by the reduced size of the tree rings of that and the following year. The symptoms of a new disease spread. It was the beginning of the first documented epidemic known as the Justinian plague because it took place during the reign of Roman Emperor Justinian. The illness devastated Constantinople. It is estimated that millions of people died in the Roman Empire alone. So more than 1/4 of the world's population perished. In his chronicle, Michael the Syrian, a bishop that was writing much later in the 12th century, recorded the event, and he said that the sun darkened. It was like the moon, that it was tame, and during the whole year, the sun looked like an eclipse, and the beams that it shed did not produce any heat, and so it was really difficult for people. In Italy, Cassiodoro stated that we have had a winter without storms, a spring without mildness, a summer without heat. In Mesopotamia, large numbers of birds perished, as well as in what is now Greece, and Constantinople was devastated by famine. And in some parts of China, snow fell during the summer months. During the last 3 months of 2022, last year, I was with the team of talented artists that work in my studio by my side, Philippe Byrne, Tatiana Guerrero, Ricardo Urrutia, in Sachet, in the French countryside, working for a 3-month period at Atelier Calder. The studio built there by the American sculptor Alexander Calder. Our objective was to build a speculative version of the Ilopango volcano in steel. My plan was to build it in sections that could be assembled. At the same time, the scale of Atelier Calder allowed me to make a large-scale version of the volcano that I might not have been able to build in my Los Angeles studio. The sculpture is about 12 feet in height and 19.5 feet in width and approximately 8 feet in depth, because the original idea was to send it to the Americas assembled over a shipping container, which had those dimensions. The winter made it too dangerous for us to do that, so the work traveled not on top, but inside a blue shipping container on the vessel called Harmony with a Hong Kong flag. It crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Maybe I should go get my computer because I don't think I can concentrate. Do you mind if I take a tiny break and run over there to get my computer? Okay, hold on. I can do this super fast. Okay. I don't know what's happening. It's alive. But I have to find it so I can. All right, here it is. So where were we going? Costco, right? Okay. Okay, so anyway, instead of traveling on top of the shipping container, I traveled inside a blue shipping container on top of this boat carried by the Costco Harmony. Maybe the projector, so yeah, we can do this. Okay. So it crossed the Atlantic Ocean, and during the first 2 weeks of March, on its way to Los Angeles, where we continued to work on the sculpture, eventually the sculpture made it to Storm King Art Center by the Hudson River in New York. And so working outside one's own studio is never easy, and making a large-scale sculpture without having your tools, without having your equipment, without having your space to keep moving because of the different reasons that included the fact that when we got to Atelier Calder didn't weld, and I didn't realize that Calder really didn't have any welders, and so we had to build a welding shop. You know, and so all this made it really interesting because the volcano itself, even though it was meant to be the volcano that left, was always on the move and in the process of being made, was being made in all these different places, locations, circumstances that made it really unique, especially in the way that it assembles. We had to make the most unpractical joints because we had to assemble the front and then assemble the back without making it assembled, you know, in layers that would be the logical thing to do, etc. So that was really interesting for me, and in this case, a surprise awaited. The fact that Calder didn't weld also reminded me that there's a way in which some large-scale works were made, especially in the 20th century, but even today that were fabricated. Before ACAD and other programs existed, they were still fabricated in a factory with machines and without being made by hand in the way that we were making this piece. In reality, what we were doing in my studio is I was improvising every line, and we were cutting those lines with angles, and we were placing the pieces of the cut bar on the floor or in the air and welding them together, and then beating sheet metal with round ball hammers over sacks of sand. And so Atelier Calder helped us put together this welding shop, a welding table, a cutting station, a metal saw, etc. But it was not just that, it was the way in which the sculptures are made in my studio that entered in such a striking contrast with Calder's work. And that taught me a lot about, among other things, how does one go about building a volcano? And when you're making a volcano and each line is drawn at the time that its need emerges, how do you decide what goes next, etc.? How do you see something that is so large, that is slowly eating up all the space, that suddenly your saw is inside the volcano, your welding table is inside the volcano, your cutting station is inside, everything is inside, we have to crawl, we have to jump. And so we started drawing the lines with chalk, and it wasn't until much later that we were able to install it on the landscape, just a frame to at least be able to see it and see how it would come together. Seeing it laying flat was really difficult. So I had originally imagined the making of this work as an effort to reconstitute a body with particles that had disseminated all over the planet. Bringing them together was not an effort to recreate the volcano, to bring it back to its origins, but rather it was an effort to make it visible, to make matter visible, to make the matter that circulated all over the planet and in the cosmos as part of the atmosphere visible, to speak of the motion of matter, of queer matter. And by this I mean matter that can be defined, and yet we don't know where it's been and we don't know where it's going. It's matter that moves away from identity towards the emergence of a spontaneous and self-organizing collective nomadic subjectivities. And potentially towards life. It is matter that flows and disappears, matter that spreads from the organic to the non-organic and back and runs between them, etc. So allow me to go back to these ideas one at a time. Since ancient times, in what we now call Mesoamerica or Central America, which is the region of the planet where I was born, there is the idea that mountains move. There's the idea that there's a huge snake under the ground that moves, and its body, when it moves, forms the mountains. And that idea, even though it's not visible at human scale or at human temporalities, allows people to think that the landscape is in motion, even if we're not able to perceive it with our eyes. And that is basically the definition of a hyperobject. And I have always been really interested in teaching philosophy, for example, when teaching a class to my graduate students, teaching philosophy, but at the same time reading a text and then imagining the conversation that this text is having with a stone, an ancient stone that carries similar ideas to those. And so I will never be able to figure out why some images don't move and some images move. It will always be a mystery, but here we go. And so this idea of a hyperobject is really interesting to me because in ancient times, the idea was also developed by the Olmec, they would lay out mosaics of huge size, either for the cosmos or they would bury them under the ground, and they were meant for the underworld. And I'll show you one of those in a moment. But here we are. This is an image of Ricardo, who's beating the metal, and Guillermo, who's a filmmaker from El Salvador, who has been following us in the making of the volcano as he's making a film about this volcano. He wanted to try and see how it was to beat the metal. Like a lot of our friends and family, everyone comes and beats metal for a little bit, etc. And so that's what this photo is about. And I wanted to show you another thing, that we're working at Atelier Calder, this beautiful place that has these wooden floors, but we're working in the basement where there's basically dirt floor and a small section of concrete, because it's the only place where we wouldn't burn down the building. That's the other point that nobody thought about until we got there. And so my exhibition, When I Yes, When I Know, examined the Earth's movement and that of its inhabitants. It was also about the ceaseless circulation and transmutation of matter through vehicles such as volcanic eruptions and traveling meteors. In this way, my objective was to pose that migration is a geological constant and that these fugitive self-organizing particles comprise all matter and align with conceptions of the ancient underworld. It also required to think of steel as an organic material that emerges from the earth, that is part of the extractive process that is killing the planet, to return it to its organic state, to return it to the earth, to return it to being stone, is also a way of becoming other. One central metaphor in this exhibition was the meteor. Considered a cosmic missive, in this case the meteor was following the pattern of the volcanic eruption and emerging from within the bowels of the earth onto the surface of the earth. By crossing this portal, the meteor reminds us that land, and therefore the cosmos, is in motion, always migrating, and matter is a living archive of these motions. There's a sign inside the Griffith Observatory that I love that says, "The ancient history of the universe is written in a faint glow of cosmic background radiation." And so I was kind of thinking about this, that every time I would make one of my rocks, I would think about whether or not to seal it, to apply patina, to let it rust in place, to allow the environment to mark it, to allow people to see how organic steel is and how radiation is marking it, etc. In his book, Metamorphosis, Emanuele Coccia poses an argument that resembles the beliefs of ancient peoples in the Americas, that we are adrift, that the entire planet is filled with geological sections, adrift and in perpetual motion. He writes, "There's no terra firme, there's no stable and definite forms. All the continents are floats in motion, boats that transport all the living beings from one side to the other of the planet, above and below their surface. From a planetary perspective, life migrates. And so this is the recycling plant at Ville Perdue, which is really close to Atelier Calder, one of my favorite places, and we went there many times to gather materials, to collect ideas, to think of a volcano itself being present there, because there is this volcanic mass there. And being in this location, without a doubt, impacted us. For me, there were lots of people who came to that region in France to see the castles, because there's like 100 castles in that area. But to me, the most amazing two locations were Ville Perdue and the troglodyte caves, and I was really impacted by that because in my mind, troglodyte architecture would be something that was not very sophisticated, but they're incredible. I have enormous respect for troglodyte architecture. And so here's an image of Tatiana, Philippe, and I looking at some of these materials. Here's an image of one of the entrances to a troglodyte cave that were close by to us. And so that was really important to me because it was a way in which I could imagine another entrance to the underworld in this place where I was making this work. And so just before going to France, I had made these two stelas. They're Stella Ilopango, Stella A, and Ilopango, Stella B, and they talk about the migration of these particles. This one, the migration of the particles of Ilopango over the landscape of different parts of the world until getting to Los Angeles, because I made it in Los Angeles. And that one talks about the migration of people over the particles. And in my mind, that was especially this Stella B. It's very poetic and also kind of healing because it allowed me to imagine that people who migrate from Mesoamerica, from the lower part of Mexico, from Central America, which are the majority of immigrants coming from the Americas across the US border, were really crossing and stepping over the soil of the underworld of their own soil. And that was a beautiful idea because nations are very young, they're only 200 years old, and the land and those particles have been here for many, many, many more centuries. And so I began thinking about these, and I'm going to show you some close-ups. But also, I wanted to tell you about the volcano and the movement of the volcano. And so, as I move through these close-ups, I want to tell you how I'm interested in translating these ideas from the realm of space to the realm of time, and to imagine all these untimely conversations between particles of land, between different types of matter that belong in different landscapes and different temporalities, and that continue to exist together in the soil that we step on today. And so these untimely and these long temporalities are ideas that inform the work that I was making while at Atelier Calder and later on in my studio and at Storm King, where you see the stela installed. This is Stela C, the third stela that I made. And so let me tell you a little bit about these. Cosmic Mirror, which are the rocks that are on the landscape, is installed following the layout of what we call Orion, a constellation that I could see in the sky over San Salvador when I was little. And if we reorient our sky, I can see in the sky over Los Angeles today. And so we placed it in the way in which it's seen at Storm King, thinking about the fact that this constellation that we call Orion's Belt, in El Salvador we call Los Tres Reyes Magos, and in Palenque, where King Pacal lived, there's an inscription that says that the sky that had this constellation over it when he was conceived had other names. And so I was thinking of this constellation also as a time machine, as a way to imagine that all these people are stargazers looking at this constellation and seeing it from different places and different temporalities, but forming a community of stargazers at the same time. And the stela, I'm almost done, I'm just looking at the time because I want to make sure that we leave some time for questions. So the stela, what it's doing is moving back in time. The stela has inscriptions that talk about what the volcano is going to do since its arrival at Storm King, since before its arrival at Storm King. And this is an Olmec layout, so you can have an idea of the hyper-objects that the Olmec built 2,900 years ago. But I'm going to move quickly through this so that we can talk, have a conversation. But in the making of the volcano, I was also thinking about all this, and this is us working in my studio in Los Angeles, and this is us putting it together at Storm King, and this is a view that allows you to see how it's assembled, how it comes together. And the stela is one single piece, and so it doesn't come apart because it's not that tall. It's probably a few inches less than 9 feet tall. You can see it here. I'm standing in front of it in my studio. And some of the images that it has include the idea that this volcano traveled over a shipping container from crossing the Atlantic, that it arrived in Los Angeles, that it came by truck to my studio, and that it arrived to Building 5 as the door to our studio, and that it was installed in this way. You can see the stela in the stela, and next to the volcano and the constellation, that it will travel over a fireboat crossing the Hudson River from where it is now to Troy, where it will be on view at the MPAC at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And so I want to finish with this idea that the volcano is going to leave Storm King before the show ends. It's going to leave 2 weeks before the show ends, and we're going to have an event where it will navigate for 3 days over the Hudson River. And we'll stop at the Maritime Museum for a while, and then we'll continue to Troy, to the Federal Lock number 1, etc. And this is a view of the Hudson River. And so the river is a really interesting place because it's a place that has tides and that has salt water and fresh water. And so that's one of the things that really fascinated me since almost pretty much after I said hello to Lori. She took me to see where the salt water and the fresh water meet here as well, because I'm fascinated by the way in which these forces, the different density of the waters, create different forces. The gravity of the earth, the gravity of the moon, the gravity of the sun is pulling in different directions. So the Hudson travels about 6 hours north and about 6 hours south, and then about 6 hours north and about 6 hours south. That's why it's going to take us 3 days to navigate with the volcano over the Hudson. And we're going to take it apart on October 26th. We're going to install it over the boat. We're going to then move on the boat on the 27th to the Maritime Museum, and on the 29th to Troy. And in this process, we're going to think a lot about what it means. I'm imagining here it traveling on top, I photoshopped it on top of Robert Smithson's floating island. But it will travel actually in a fireboat that looks like this. And so in that effort then to see the boat carrying a volcano, the volcano floating over the Hudson, the movement of land, the idea that land is in motion and flowing over water, etc. That became really important to me, and it became a metaphor for the migration of land, a way to make visible not only the particles that were lost or the particles that were disseminated all over the world, but also to make visible the fact that there's a void that we all leave everywhere we are, and then when we leave a void, and that void continues to exist, continues to interact with others around us, continues to exist as a being. And the existence of this voice has become really important for me. This is what basically is going to be left at Storm King after we move the volcano. And so I want to finish with an idea. For me to move the volcano up the river to the impact at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where it will be a part of another show called Shifting Center, will provide many opportunities to experience simultaneity of temporalities and spaces. It will be an opportunity to cross the temporal portal activated by the stela. It will allow us to experience a void by the volcano that left, a void that exists over the Ilopango volcano today, that it exists over the landscape in Sachet, that will be left at Storm King, and also as it crosses the river and its multiple waters and its multiple tides and its multiple temporalities, while it fulfills the prediction made by the stela. A void is a hole. A hole is a portal is a spout that pours other worlds into ours, that fills our dimension with others, that brings simultaneity. It is a window to the multiverse. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. A few minutes for Q&A. And we can gather some questions quickly so that everyone can go to lunch, but I would love to hear your questions if you have any. Yes?
Is it meant to rust?
No.
So how do you prevent that?
It's a good question, and it requires maintenance. Like all the sculptures that are outside at Storm King, there's a lot of sculptures. They are constantly, and a lot of the sculptures in Los Angeles, they're constantly covered with wax, sealed with lacquer, maintained every certain period of time. People have to go and apply more wax because the wax takes all the weather and then protects the lacquer. So if you do that, potentially you can, a layer of lacquer can, in Los Angeles, for example, be there for like 8 years, but in a place like New York or here in Seattle where it's more humid, I don't know if you could do that with mild steel. Probably you would have to switch to another material if you didn't want it to rust. But for me, there's still something important in the tiny little, you know, the organic way in which the metal behaves. And so I am aware that, for example, we are able to seal the inner part of the bars, and the wells are porous, and all these things that are visible when you see it from up close. Those are important to me, but of course, I am not being practical or efficient if you're thinking of making a building, right? So the sculpture is alive in so many ways. Yes?
Is your sculpture going to eventually keep traveling and maybe end up in San Salvador?
You know, believe it or not, originally when we were thinking that we would take it to El Salvador and we would sink it in the lake. But the government of El Salvador sold the lake to China, and I don't think that we will get away with it because China has a contract to make potable water out of the lake. And so I don't think we can do that anymore, but I don't know what's going to happen. I only know what's going to happen what the stela tells me, which is that it's going to go through the impact. I don't know what happens afterwards. If you see the stela, it has a black area at the bottom, so the future is open. I'm good, thank you. So, any other questions? Yes.
Your work seems, you obviously come from a very academic and conceptual background with your sculpture, and it seems to me you're doing research and then creating, but do you ever have kind of imagery in mind first and then do research, or is it always research?
Right now I'm making an iceberg in the shape of an iceberg that I saw because it only lasted like 2 hours, and it had these columns and this architecture that was self-carving matter. And I couldn't believe it, and I was able to film it. I went in a Zodiac and went around it, and I filmed it, and I have that documentation, so I'm trying to make that, I guess, icebergs have greater concentration of bubbles in some areas, and those, when they heat up, carve from within. So they had archways, and it had hallways and columns and caves. I just thought self-carving matters too much. I have to do that, but usually I don't do that. I just make it up. So nobody knows it's going to look like, and the artists in my studio are very patient. People ask them all the time, what is this going to be? They don't know. They don't know. I don't know either, so I cannot tell them. It's not that I don't want to tell them. But usually I don't do that.
Do you see these as vessels at all? Because they're public spaces, they could be molds, they could be voids into themselves, like that little thin area of what we're seeing on the outside. What do you think about what's inside?
Yeah, I mean, there's something very related to the spaceships in the volcano. I think that it would be beautiful to imagine a spaceship made as a volcano. I love that idea. And being inside, there's resonance. So for example, right now when we travel over the Hudson, we're going to put sensors and mics so that we can pick up the sonority. Because imagine that when the crater that's open travels north, all the wind is going to be entering there, and it's going to become like a musical instrument. And when we install it at the impact, it's going to be installed in the middle of the seats of a concert hall that has 360 tracks of sound. So it's going to be an effort to also study like the resonance of steel. But I think that, I didn't really make it as a vessel, and I was making it in a rush because of the deadline, because of the haphazard way in which we build it. It's really dangerous. It's like going inside a place full of knives, and I highly recommend one of those masks for, what do you call it? No.
Fencing.
I don't think that it's very safe to be inside, especially if you're not careful. There's knives everywhere. Like in the arbor for Rufina Maya, it looks like a beautiful dress, but there's knives inside. So if it needs to be a spaceship, it needs to be remade in the interior, indeed, or modified in the interior. I think it's time for lunch, but if you want, we could continue talking while we eat around in the building. Thank you so much.
All right, it is lunchtime, so 1:30. Please do your level best to get back here by 1:30. We'd like to keep on schedule if we can. So enjoy lunch. We'll see you guys downstairs or in the lobby.